there has been such an imbalance of truth, right, about the origin of Christianity in Africa. Christianity wasn't introduced through slavery. It actually existed centuries before colonialism, centuries prior to that, right? In 2016, for example, some scientists had discovered that the earliest known physical evidence of a church was in sub-Saharan Africa, right? Literally, one of the oldest churches was established in the 4th century AD, and this was in Ethiopia. Now, look at the beauty here, because when we're talking about one of the oldest churches in Ethiopia, it gives us an understanding around a lot of supernatural activity that happened that was actually, accounted for biblically, connected to the gospel getting to an Ethiopian eunuch.
And Christianity began as a black man's religion. It's an African religion.
African spirituality has always been synonymous to the acknowledgement and worship of the Almighty Creator, the One. People like Mbiti, 1980, argue that before the coming of the missionaries, Africans already knew God, and this is the same God found in the Bible. Nkomazana, the year 2007, supports this view, giving an example of the Botswana people of Botswana. The religion of Botswana was from time immemorial monotheistic. Botswana traditionally believed in a single supreme being, whom they called Modimo, literally meaning the one who is supreme and above. Modimo was believed to be the creator, maker, originator, and source of all things, including life. Islam and Islam, 2015, assert that the idea of the oneness of God is a given in African traditional religion, in other words, known with the acronym ATR. In African traditional religion, God is also believed to be supreme. God is supreme and great over all visible and invisible beings or things that we believe to exist. For example, the Ndebele name of God is Unkulunkulu, which means the Great Great One. Like them, the Tonga, the Ngoni, the Akan, the Baluba, and some other tribes designate God as Great God, or Great One, or the Great King. However, centuries of colonialism suppressed, distorted, and erased African traditions, disconnecting people from their heritage and cultural identity. Colonial powers imposed their values, dismissing African customs as primitive or backward. This cultural imperialism stripped Africans of their agency, forcing abandonment of sacred practices, connection to land and forebears. Today, in this video, we rise up to shatter the chains of colonialism, reclaiming our indigenous spirituality and rediscovering the African God, our ancestral source of power and wisdom. We challenge the status quo, rejecting the narrative that our spirituality is primitive, backward, and inferior. To support our works, kindly subscribe to our channel if you're yet to. Hit the like button and share our eye-opening Black narratives with friends and family all across the globe to spread awareness and empower communities. Now, let's delve into the full digest on why African spirituality still matters in today's world. Despite centuries of external influences and imposed beliefs, African spirituality remains a vital component of the continent's identity. However, the legacy of colonialism, slavery, and cultural suppression has led many to question the relevance of traditional African spirituality in today's world. Spirituality in Africa has indeed faced significant challenges, with the domination of Islamic and Judeo-Christian beliefs eroding its vitality. These external belief systems were forcibly imposed through brutal military conquests, deception, and cultural assimilation policies. The transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, and missionary activities disrupted Africa's spiritual fabric, often portraying indigenous practices as heathen or backward. As a result, many Africans have been disconnected from their ancestral traditions, leading to a loss of cultural identity and spiritual autonomy. In contemporary societies where liberal democracies are underpinned by inalienable individual rights, it is regressive to force people to subscribe to a particular set of religious beliefs. People have the unfettered freedom to choose religious beliefs of their choice and to exercise such without undue hindrance from the state. But this argument rests on the Western concept of human rights, which dictates an unalterable system that must be used as the sole global template for civilization. This Western system of human rights, which viewed the white propertied male individual as the single standard for universal rationality, is in many ways intrusive in the indigenous knowledge systems of African societies. Even where one asserts that each individual has the right to choose their religious belief system, as per Western templates of human rights and civilization, questions around identity, belonging, and fulfillment are inescapable. For the most part, the innate understanding of Islamic and Judeo-Christian religious beliefs by Africans is questionable. And this largely relates to the specific strands of Christianity that Africa finds itself with. The truism of Christianity being exploited as a colonial tool for imperial domination is lost on many sections of African populations. But perhaps the reason why it is easy to be identified with Christianity is because of its perceived notions of civility as well as success in education. The history of Christianity in Africa began long before European involvement. It dates back to the apostolic era, when Christianity's founders spread the gospel throughout the continent. In the 1st century CE, Christian communities emerged in North Africa, particularly in Egypt, Carthage, and Ethiopia. The apostles themselves, including Mark and Matthew, are believed to have evangelized in these regions. As Christianity took hold, North Africa became a hub of vibrant Christian activity. Theologians and leaders like Athanasius, Clement of Alexandria, Anthony, Pachomius, Origen, Tertullian, and Augustine shaped the universal church. Their contributions were immense, with Tertullian's writings on Christian doctrine and Augustine's works on theology and philosophy leaving an indelible mark. Sadly, missing from a whole number of people's understanding of Christianity is that a significant number of the church fathers were African. Tertullian and Cyprian wrote from Carthage, modern-day Tunisia, Origen of Alexandria, Egypt, and Augustine from Hippo Regius, now Annaba, Algeria. But most people assume these church fathers to be Roman or Greek Christians living in Africa as part of the Roman Empire, but they weren't. Origen was Coptic. Augustine and Cyprian were Berbers. Both Coptics and Berbers are indigenous people, groups native to northern Africa. Tertullian was slightly different. He was Punic. Punics were a Semitic people who had come from Canaan and settled in northern Africa in the early Iron Age. But what is clear is that these 4 church fathers weren't stereotypical white men. They were Africans with North African skin tones. Deep discoveries show that African theologians were the ones who significantly shaped the Nicene and Athanasian creeds, along with other theologians who lived in Africa, such as Athanasius, Clement, Ambrose, Pachomius, Cyprian, and so many others. These giants of church history fought off heresies such as Gnosticism, Arianism, Montanism, Marcionism, Pelagianism, and Manichaeism. They also helped elucidate the Christian view of the Trinity and taught ancient Christians how to interpret the scriptures correctly. Amongst these mighty men, Augustine stands head and shoulders above the rest. He was a prolific writer, leaving behind 113 books, 218 letters, and over 500 sermons. 2 of his books, Confessions and City of God, are considered classics and shaped theological thinking for many centuries to come. A true indigenous North African is one of the greatest theologians Christendom has ever had. Take Western European art as an example. Yeshua, the one you know to be Jesus, is often painted as a blue-eyed, pale-skinned European. In contrast, Yeshua and his original disciples were 1st century Levantine Jews, most likely brown-eyed, black-haired, and black-skinned. They weren't Western Europeans or whites. Colonial Western art in misleading. Christianity has been active in Africa since the time immemorial. Therefore, it is inaccurate to call Christianity a white man's religion. Christianity is a religion that started in the Near East and traveled to both Africa and Europe at the same time. In saying this, we don't ignore the fact that colonialism spread Christianity in Africa, but it often brought with it the baggage of European culture, giving the impression that Christianity is European. During the 2nd and 3rd centuries, North Africa flourished as a center of Christian scholarship and spirituality. Theologians adapted Christianity to local cultures, creating unique expressions of faith. Christians gathered in churches, monasteries, and households, fostering strong social bonds. The Desert Fathers, led by Anthony and Pachomius, pioneered monasticism, emphasizing spiritual discipline and communal living. During the pre-colonial age, African enlightenment was characterized by deep spirituality, with believers embracing the mystical dimensions of their faith. Indigenous leadership allowed African spirituals to guide their own churches, free from external control. Contextual theology enabled Africans to express Christianity through local customs and traditions. Aurelius Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, was a pivotal figure in this era. His writings on grace, free will, and the nature of God continue to influence Christian thought. Origen, an Egyptian scholar, pioneered biblical interpretation, laying the groundwork for future generations. Before European colonization, Africa was home to a rich tapestry of spiritual traditions. African traditional religions and indigenous Christian communities thrived, untainted by colonialism. These vibrant faiths were authentic, culturally relevant, and spiritually fervent, expressing the deepest aspects of African cultures. African traditional religions were diverse and complex, deeply rooted in African cultures. Spirituality was holistic, recognizing no separation between the spiritual and physical realms. Ancestors played a vital role, mediating between the living and the divine. Nature was revered, with many deities associated with natural phenomena. Community worship and shared rituals were central to African spirituality. African concepts of God varied, often blending monotheistic and polytheistic aspects. The divine was seen as immanent, present in everyday life. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church stood out as a distinct and independent godly tradition, unconnected to European missionary work. Ethiopian Christians spread their faith throughout Africa prior to European contact. In these pre-colonial African faiths, spirituality was a lived experience, connecting people with the divine, honoring ancestors, and finding meaning in life. African traditional religions and indigenous Christian communities flourished, nurturing vibrant cultures and communities. The 4th and 5th centuries, however, were difficult for the church in North Africa, marked by doctrinal issues and internal struggles that divided the church. And the arrival of Islam in the 7th century CE and subsequent European colonization disrupted this thriving spiritual landscape. The introduction of Christianity to sub-Saharan Africa began in the 15th century with the arrival of Portuguese traders and missionaries in West Africa, first in Guinea, Mauritania, the Gambia, Ghana, and Sierra Leone, then Nigeria, and later in the Kingdom of Congo, where they would find success in converting prominent local leaders to Catholicism. Later, in 1652, some Dutch traders established the Dutch Reformed Church in the South. However, most Africans continued to practice their indigenous religions until the 19th century, when Christian missions increased, driven by an anti-slavery crusade and European colonization. European powers leveraged Christianity to expand their empires, imposing their culture, language, and values while exploiting Africa's natural resources. They suppressed indigenous African cultures and traditions, replacing them with European customs. This colonization destabilized the status quo, bringing opportunities to some while undermining the power of others. Christian missions introduced education, literacy, and hope to marginalized communities. However, the rigid European form of Christianity denied people pride in their culture and ceremonies. Commercial speculators followed, capitalizing on the newly opened territories. The spread of Christianity had varying success, with limited impact in regions where Islam had already taken hold. Nonetheless, Christianity's influence transformed Africa, reshaping the continent's history, culture, and identity. European colonizers utilized Christianity as a tool to invade and dominate Africa, perpetuating cultural suppression and economic exploitation. Arguably, the swift European colonization of the African continent, as crystallized by the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, would have been impossible without the insidious role played by Christian missionaries. Christianity was used to calm and control African people, while also using force and violence to make them obey. Christian missionaries established mission centers, providing Western education and health, effectively erasing the intrinsic indigenous knowledge systems that constituted African identity for centuries. Everything African was immediately incorrigible. African civilization was deemed paganistic, barbaric, backward, and in urgent need of saving. Colonialism claimed to aim to modernize Africa through business, Western values, and Christianity, but in reality, it was a pretext to invade and exploit Africa's rich natural resources, gain economic and political superiority over African nations, and impose foreign values and beliefs to undermine African cultures and identities. Though Islam didn't colonize Africa in the same way, both Christian and Islamic powers viewed African customs as backward and hindering progress. King Leopold II of Belgium, who callously owned present-day Democratic Republic of Congo as his personal property, sent a letter to missionaries instructing them to wipe away all African spirituality and supplant it with Western Christianity. He told them to take away the Africans' identity and pacify them into docile passivity that would make the exploitation of natural resources for profits an easy process. Through the process of colonial domination, Africans viewed their spirituality as lacking in depth and salvation, barbaric, evil, and irredeemably primitive. Africans were taught that their traditional religions were worthless and uncivilized, and this damaging belief persists today, affecting how Africans see themselves and their heritage. European Christianity taught Africans to hate themselves. The African mind was thus totally colonized, a massive brain operation, a term employed by the late Zimbabwean literary iconoclast Dambudzo Marachera. The same applies to Islam. It shunned the supremacy of African indigenous spirituality. As such, it is clear that colonial Christianity was used as a colonial tool in Africa, thus legitimizing the brutal capitalist systems that cause untold poverty and inequality today. African indigenous spirituality remains an indispensable aspect of African morality. African religions shun voracious individualism and greed, and aim towards achieving a holistic society in which the individual good must translate into public good, and public good must translate into individual good. Christianity today now reflects a neo-colonial outlook where it preaches the rapacious message of gospel entrepreneurship underpinned by a desire for individual materialist wealth and success. Western Christianity effectively upholds neoliberal capitalism. Colonial-era Christianity was marked by foreign-led churches, westernized theology, and missionary paternalism. Africans were seen as heathens in need of civilization and salvation. This imposed form of Christianity undermined the authenticity and richness of pre-colonial African spirituality. According to historian Dr. Thomas Oden in his book, How Africa Shaped the Christian Mind, Oden emphasizes that African Christianity predates European colonization and that the faith was more vibrant and authentic before colonialism. Another historian, Dr. Kwame Bediako, notes that pre-colonial African Christianity was a non-Western religion that flourished without European influence. Bediako argues that colonial-era Christianity disrupted the natural development of African Christianity. A whole millennia before any European nation docked their ships, Christianity had been flourishing in Africa. The gospel was already spreading in Africa by African heralds. Christianity's expansion beyond Jerusalem is often overlooked, but its southern trajectory into Africa is particularly fascinating. While Roman North Africa's Christianization is well documented, the faith's penetration deeper into the continent is less explored. As historian and theologian Dr. Thomas Oden notes, Africa was the first continent after Asia to receive the gospel. Christianity spread south from Jerusalem, alongside its westward and eastward trajectories. The Ethiopian eunuch's conversion, as recorded in Acts 8 verses 26 to 40, marks one of the earliest documented instances of African Christianity. This event, around 30 to 40 AD, predates Roman North Africa's Christianization. By the 2nd century, Christianity had reached Nubia, which is present-day Sudan, and Axum, that is modern-day Ethiopia. The Aksumite Empire's adoption of Christianity in the 4th century made it one of the world's earliest Christian states. African scholars like Origen of Alexandria and Tertullian of Carthage contributed significantly to early Christian theology. The Desert Fathers, Egyptian monks who sought spiritual solitude, also shaped Christian spirituality. This rich, complex history of early African Christianity challenges the prevailing narrative that Christianity was solely a Western, European faith. Instead, it reveals a multifaceted, globally connected Christianity with African roots. The presence of Christianity in Africa predates European colonization. Evidence of this can be traced back to the earliest centuries of the Christian Church, with established Christian communities already thriving on the continent. Notably, The gospel had spread to Africa even before the age of exploration, when European explorers began navigating African coastlines. This historical fact underscores that Christianity's roots in Africa are indigenous and predates colonialism. In fact, Christianity has a rich and ancient history in Africa, dating back to the 1st century AD, long before European invasion. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest Christian denominations, was established during this time. By the 2nd century AD, Christianity had spread to various parts of Africa, including Egypt, Nubia, present-day Sudan, and Aksum, modern-day Ethiopia. This early presence of Christianity in Africa highlights the continent's significant contribution to the faith's development. The Gospels also speak of the refugee, which the Holy Family, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, took to Egypt in fear of King Herod. For this reason, we can say the Lord was in contact with Africa when he was still a child, Matthew 2, verses 13 to 15. In the Old Testament, there was already the contact with Christianity when Joseph was sold to Egypt by his brothers. Today, Egypt has a popular tradition that goes to the extent of pointing out the palm tree, which Mary is said to have embraced during the pangs of childbirth, and certain records affirm that the Holy Family spent some time in Ethiopia. Much as these traditions sound naive, but they point to the conviction that the monotheistic principle of spirituality had begun very early in Africa. To become the nation's official religion, it's likely that Christianity had already been established in the continent a long time before. For comparison, it took 2.5 centuries for Christianity to become the official religion of the Roman Empire. In the 1st century, Alexandria, Egypt, had become a hub of Christian scholarship and worship. Eusebius records gospel writer Mark arriving as early as 43 AD. Centuries later, King Ezana of Ethiopia declared Christianity the national religion in 330 AD. This historic decree cemented Ethiopia's status as one of the world's oldest Christian nations, fostering a unique African expression of faith. Eusebius and Origen, two influential early Christian scholars and theologians based in northern Africa, documented the spread of Christianity to Ethiopia in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Eusebius, known as the father of church history and origin, a renowned biblical scholar and theologian, wrote extensively on the early Christian church. Notably, they recorded Christian preaching and evangelization in Ethiopia during this period, highlighting the continent's significant role in the early spread of Christianity. Going further, there's Irenaeus of Lyons. Writing in 180 AD, he wrote that Simon Bacchus preached the coming in the flesh of God in his homeland of Ethiopia. Also, Luke writes of the 1st century conversion of an Ethiopian high official in Acts chapter 8, verses 26 to 40. Could this official have started the first church in Ethiopia? We will probably never know this side of eternity. But from all this, we can say that Christianity has been established in Ethiopia for at least 1,600 years, and possibly as far as 2,000 years back. Sadly, this ancient Christian heritage in Africa has been often ignored or underappreciated by many in the Western Christian Church for various reasons. Tragically, many African Christians remain unaware of their rich pre-colonial Christian roots due to the lingering effects of colonialism. The colonial narrative eclipsed Africa's original Christian heritage, replacing it with a Eurocentric perspective that marginalized indigenous expressions of faith. As a result, African Christians have been more familiar with the colonial version of Christianity imposed upon them by European powers rather than their own ancestral traditions. Thomas Oden's book, How Africa Shaped the Christian Mind, is an attempt to address that common ignorance or misunderstanding among so many in Christianity. Christianity and colonialism are closely associated with each other due to the service of Christianity in its various sects, namely Protestantism, Catholicism, and Orthodoxy, as the state religion of the historical European colonial powers, in which Christians likewise made up the majority. Through a variety of methods, it is obvious that Christian missionaries acted as the religious arms of the imperialist powers of Europe. According to Edward E. Andrews, Associate Professor of Providence College, Christian missionaries were initially portrayed as visible saints, exemplars of ideal piety in a sea of persistent savagery. However, by the time the colonial era drew to a close in the later half of the 20th century, Missionaries were viewed as ideological shock troops for colonial invasion, whose zealotry blinded them, colonialism's agent, scribe, and moral alibi. In some regions, almost all of a colony's population was forcibly turned away from its traditional belief systems and forcibly turned towards the Western Christian faith, which colonizers used as a justification for their extermination of adherents of other faiths, their enslavement of natives, and their exploitation of lands and seas. Over the centuries, the story of Christian theology has been told from a European perspective. However, Thomas Oden stood to tell that story differently. He stated that classical Christian theology was heavily shaped by Africans. The language used to worship the Trinity, the received definitions of Christ's two natures, the early church's methods for restoring repentant sinners, the basic patterns of monastic life, our fundamental approach to biblical interpretation, and the church's devotion to its martyrs. All these things have their roots in African theological debate, African prayer, and African Bible study. Over a period of nearly 2 millennia, the church has spread all over Africa. However, over the past 3 centuries, colonization critically influenced the character of the church in Africa. Recently, a strong African consciousness and critical approach to Africanized Christianity have developed, aiming to decolonize and de-Westernize it. This research endeavors to contribute to the dialectical and critical debate surrounding the Africanization of Christianity. The main objective is to connect hermeneutical principles to Africanized Christianity from a holistic perspective, employing them interactively. Although these principles have received attention in the past, this research approaches some from different perspectives to constitute a more holistic and coherent picture, relating to the latest comprehensive hermeneutical approach in biblical hermeneutics. In closing, Christianity is African. Christianity was not a religion brought by the white man to Africa. It's not even a white man's religion. Christianity is a religion of the world, and Africans were some of its earliest worshipers and theologians. We need to celebrate this history and help people understand that the gospel is for everyone, whatever their culture or background, and given this history, especially if that culture or background is African. That brings us to the end of yet another interesting video. Did you happen to learn a thing or two on the subject? Then do not hesitate. Reach out to us in the comment section. Offer up your thoughts on anything of note, and we would be glad to pick from them. Don't forget to hit the thumb button also. Share video with as many as you can to keep spreading our Black truths. And consider subscribing if you're yet to. Hit the notification button to always stay put. Thank you for watching.